Well, today I have the pleasure of getting a chance to talk to someone who I was clued in about from Jane Rigler. She talked an awful lot about this person and then suggested that she would be a great interviewee, and so I took that as marching orders because when Jane tells me to do something, I do it generally. The person I'm going to be interviewing today is Elizabeth Hoffman. She is an instructor at, or assistant professor, right?
Full professor, actually.
Full professor now.
Full professor.
At NYU, correct? Still?
Correct.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And also is an active composer and performer, and also has got a really interesting set of career trails that we're going to try and talk about a little bit. But mostly I want to just find out more about Elizabeth and how she got where she is. So first of all, hi Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm honored to be interviewed.
Oh, thanks.
And,
well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you being willing to put up with it.
Yeah, Jane is one of several performers with whom I've had many collaborations over the last 5 or 10 years, and I'm really grateful for all of Jane's provocations to keep returning to outgrowths of some of the same projects. So she's been really instrumental in my development, in particular over the last few years.
Sure.
And it's one example of things that happen completely outside of my local sphere, my local academic connections, because we don't actually see each other that much. But the projects I've done with her are testament to the fact that it's possible to work on things long distance and have some really productive results. That are oriented toward particular end goals and pieces that we've worked to completion.
So, when the last time I visited Jane, it sounded like you and she were working on were very actively working on a project right at that moment. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was about?
Sure. We just performed a piece about 2 weeks ago that was a multimedia work that involved live video, live sound, and live flutes. And it was the outgrowth of a project that began as a research project in which Jane received a grant from HarvestWorks to do some exploration of sensor technology. And we began working together on that. And parallel with the technical goals, Jane also had this longstanding commitment to certain, I'd say, theatrical and philosophical ideas of working with a story that's been realized in no theater, but it comes from 12th century Japanese story. Starting from that, we developed a mini monodrama, in which Jane was the protagonist. This is actually the second project I've done with Jane in which the piece is a sort of mini character study. My part in these two related projects, has been to develop a set of electroacoustic instruments that I can play as chamber music with Jane's flute playing.
Oh, interesting. So what do these instruments look like? Are they computer based, or are they a combination of physical instrument and computer? Or
yeah, that's a great question, because I have actually built years ago some acoustic instruments, but these are entirely Max MSP based computer instruments.
I see.
Some of them process Jane, but most of them use pre-recorded materials and allow me to improvise a little bit. There are exploratory structures that include some decisions that we make in advance, but they allow a lot of freedom with temporal progression of events and spatialization and live there's so many features that I've built into some of these instruments that it's sort of like playing a very complicated, if you can imagine playing a bass clarinet without knowing how to play it, like you're sort of exploring. That's not a great analogy, but
okay. So this puts you in. This gives you an opportunity to do some exploration. Now, I'm always curious with individuals that do this kind of work, because the balance of how much is sort of like predefined and pre-established versus how much is truly, done on the fly. And I think sometimes it can be especially difficult to know what that's like when you're dealing with something that's a Max MSP program, for example. Because you could very well, just basically have a very complicated set of sliders that just played back an audio file, right? So I'm wondering, what is the atomic level of what you're doing? Are you capturing samples and then manipulating them with audio effects? Are you affecting a live stream? Are you trying to do on-the-fly sampling and rearranging? What are the kinds of things that you focus on when you're doing this sort of thing?
Sure, these are great questions. If I may, I'm just going to backtrack a minute and a second and say something about your first observation.
Thank you.
About that it could be when an audience hears something without having a close-up view of what the composer is doing with sliders or the interface. You don't really know whether you're hearing what manifests that makes it sound live and in the moment. One thing that I concluded during our last performance was that spatialization that's very sensitively responding to the particular space is an invaluable part of live performance, in that some things that I composed, I've been working most recently in an 8-channel studio, and I thought I had some things that were very solid in terms of the spatial design being significant and being compelling. And then when I tried it in the space where we were performing the piece, some of those things did not work at all. And that had to do with the size of the radius of the speaker array. It had to do with the type of reverberation in the space. It had to do with the drama that we were working out in terms of where Jane was moving in relation to the sound movement. And so I felt very good about having tools that were so responsive that I could, on the fly, redesign the movement patterns of the sounds. In theory, one could do that with a stereo file and a mixer. Mm-hmm. And a good diffuser can just create magic. But there's different things that you can do when you're working with multi-channel audio. One thing I've been working with a lot, to get to your second question, is to design instruments that separate spectral elements of recorded sounds from the instrumentalist, and either artificially recombine them or manipulate them. So I might select, I'm very interested in harmonic, like subsets of a rich timbre. So I'll analyze the sound in real time and take out particular spectra. And I'm sort of experimenting all the time with creating meaning from artificial deconstructions of sound, of live sound in particular, in ways that, what's interesting to me is that I can't really predict what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so there were some things I was trying with a couple of years ago with spectral spatialization, mm-hmm. in which I would move the different parts of the spectrum through different speakers, trying to create a sculptural form. I think there's a number of composers out there who have been trying that sort of thing for a while. I've heard that Robert Normandeau has done a lot of work in that area. But in my case, I found that was not... It was far too subtle for the things I was aiming for. So I sort of went through that stage, and now I'm trying some other things that are just happening naturally by working in a studio and combining improvisation with composition.
I'm curious, though, because it sounds to me like spatialization is very important to how you imagine a satisfying result, right? I mean, is that fair to characterize it that way?
Yes. It's recently come to the fore, I'd say, in my own work as something that I don't want to think of composing anything without putting it in space.
Sure.
And imagining that it has a natural sort of pseudo-acoustic manifestation in the world.
So do you use anything to sort of like abstract the physical speaker location, like say something like the SPAT system or ambisonics? Do you use anything like that? Or are you sort of like hardwired into specific speaker configurations?
I've done particular projects both with, I've experimented with SPAT, and I have worked with ambisonics, and I've worked with some of the earcom programs. Years ago, I did a piece with physical modeling that involved a little bit of spatialization through tools that were not point source. And actually, I have, also recently downloaded a recent set of spatialization tools through earcom, and it is an ambisonic type controller. Mm-hmm. I haven't used it a lot. I've used it as part of larger compositional designs. So in general, I'd say I'm frequently reaching out to experiment with externals that other people have written, but I'm not relying on any one particular set as my modus operandi.
Okay. I was curious because it seems like on one hand, those tools would, because it abstracts you away from the physical connection to the speakers, it seems like that would be kind of interesting to work with, because then it's easy to imagine that happening in different locations and kind of translating in a fairly honest way into different locations. But on the other hand, it seems like actually accessing the individual speakers as sort of part of the instrument would be pretty compelling. And while it might not be so easy to translate into different spaces, like you were talking about, the change in the venue size made things different. But it does seem like you could maybe be a little more experimental or a little more adventurous with what you attempt to do with the speakers and combinations of speakers.
I think I'd agree with that. I haven't worked in that many spaces. It's kind of a luxury to work with 8 speakers, and then to have a space where you can spend a lot of hours has more than 8 speakers. I don't have a routine workspace like that, but I agree with your general comment. I think treating speakers as non-interchangeable, they're in a way they're generalizable, but in a way the particulars of even the speakers make a big difference in what works with spatialization.
Right. So I'm curious about like your working environment, your studio. What kind of studio do you have that has an 8-speaker array and doesn't just like blow the windows out or something?
Well, at NYU in the music department in arts and science, we now have a dedicated permanent array. Actually, it has 12 Genelec 8040s.
Wow. Okay.
And the room is about, I'd say, 15 by 15. It's not huge. And it's thanks to a startup fund that my colleague Jaime Oliver brought with him when he joined the department. So we were able to stake a claim on an old classroom and turn it into the lab. And it's pretty good. It's freezing, but it's good. I've also done a little tiny bit of work through the creation of a project at Virginia Tech. So I created a piece for a particular trombonist there who wanted a multi-channel work for fixed media and trombone. And that piece I composed I composed before we had our 8-channel studio. So that was really on my head, very theoretical, very detailed, but mostly it did not work in terms of, live perception. It's hard to say because one interesting question is when you're dealing with multi-channel audio, what has happened to the sweet spot? Is there a sweet spot? is one composing patterning that if a listener is in the sweet spot, which in theory I thought I was as a composer, as I was designing the patterns, could I have heard everything?
Right.
Even if the other people in the spread out in the space couldn't hear it. One thing that space introduced, which is it's a very powerful part of spatialization, I think, is the vertical dimension of our perceived sound. And when that comes into play in terms of compositional significance, it's very exciting. But it's what I did with that piece was to just do the most ambitious. I didn't intend it to be ambitious, but it proved to be ambitious because it was all in my head and I had tested the theoretical premises. But I used all of the speakers at almost every moment.
Okay.
So I had a lot of streams of movement that were being distinguished by rhythm and pitch. From the ground level, it was very hard to distinguish these things.
Okay.
That were happening across 3 tiers of height. When a lot of speakers were empty, it's easy to hear the difference between whether something's coming out on the first tier or the second tier or the third tier. But when they're all playing, I was left with sort of open-ended questions from that, hearing that piece once in there, that what sort of natural apparatus do we have in terms of being able to distinguish things at different heights?
I have interacted with different composers over the years that either have tried or felt like they had come up with ideas for sort of like the verticality of sound. I mean, you've actually kind of hit on something, and it just points out. So first of all, I apologize if it seems like I'm kind of drifting off as you're talking about these things, because in my head I'm imagining these spaces and I'm imagining what it must be like, right? And so, I'm just kind of sitting here like with my mouth agape, off in imagination world. But I think that you identified something that is really kind of key, which is as stuff gets busy, it's almost like there's a collapse of the spatialization that we're able to respond to. And, it's just yet another psychoacoustic thing that is just really fascinating. I mean, working with, I know when I teach, I talk to people about, the human ear does this and the human ear does that, but it has very little to do with the ear at all, and it has to do with all the processing that goes on in your brain in between the time that your ear gets a wave and you perceive it as something, right?
That's so true, right? And certain sounds, we tend to hear higher sounds as coming from a higher place or being located in a higher place. I've heard that on a number of occasions. There's also competing observations that include the fact that very, very high sounds are also very hard to localize. Uh-huh. So why some of them have seemed to me to be like I can reach out and grab them in a 3D space, and why other ones I can't even tell whether they're coming from in front or behind. I think there's a lot of research that hasn't been done on this.
Right.
As a composer, I find it very liberating, and it's a way into a composition from the ground up, where there are no kind of preconceptions or models that one starts from. So it kind of is very freeing. I find it very freeing.
It's a very wide open door, right? So one of the things I like doing on my podcast is exploring how people got to be the artists that they are. And I'm especially curious to know what track you took that, kind of combine. This combination of music and technology is always interesting to me anyway, because it seems like everybody gets there in a different route, right? Mm-hmm. But also, especially some of the areas of fascination that you have. I'm curious about that. And also then, I want to talk to you about some of your own music, because I took the time to listen to your CD, which I don't know how to pronounce the name of it. Interior Harmonics is what it looks like to me, so I'm sure there's a proper way to say it. But I want to talk about that release a little bit as well, because I had a chance to listen to it a little bit.
Sure, thank you.
And I have some I found it really interesting and really fascinating. So I want to talk about that. But first, tell me a little bit about your background and what it is that got you where you are today.
Sure. It starts from the time I was young, if you want to talk about my attraction to music itself. Mm-hmm. I suppose when I was in grammar school, I didn't know that I would necessarily be a professional musician, but I was playing piano from a young age. I was doing many arts, actually. I did visual art, and I believe I was doing ballet, and then gymnastics. And so I was doing a lot of things that I don't know if I thought of them as separate. They seemed more interrelated in terms of just artistic expression. But then I'd say by the time I was 14 or 15 or even younger, I made a very conscious decision that I wanted to focus on music. I remember that because I know that I announced that to my parents. And then gradually through high school, I was a good student and I was interested in a lot of other academic topics, but I really was increasingly drawn to developing my piano technique. So I was a pianist. I can't really tell you why I was so obsessed with it, because I don't think I wanted to be a concert pianist. I didn't have opportunities to do a lot of chamber music, which is what I thought I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. But by the end of high school, I had almost stopped going to high school and was just sitting home my senior year, I think, practicing piano and trying to learn pretty much all of the classical romantic repertoire and audition at conservatories. To cut to the chase here, I'll make a long story short, it didn't really work out. I didn't have the training or the coaching or the temperament to go into performance. I was waitlisted at one New York City conservatory, and then my parents were not crazy about my staying home and preparing for another year to re-audition. And eventually I went to Swarthmore College, became a music major. I dabbled in trying to do a double major in chemistry and music. That lasted not at all.
Was that in an attempt to learn something practical, or did you have...
Yeah, it was an attempt to just pull something out of a hat, I guess. But my obsession with music returned, I guess, through the back door. I took music theory for the first time, actually, in college, and all of the theory assignments became composition assignments for me. So I became a composer. I worked 1 year after my bachelor degree, and then I went back. I was accepted to a master's program at Stony Brook. I think I probably looked into that school because it had a strong performance program and it was near New York City. But serendipitously, I bumped into, before I went there, I found out that there was this really interesting composer there who did things that I'd never heard of before, electronic music, and his name was Bülent Arel, and he was originally from Turkey, and he came to the U.S. in 1957 on a Rockefeller grant and built an analog electronic studio that was still the only studio that they had there. And I went there for my master's and did analog electronic music, composed acoustic music, and felt that I think Bülent Arel had a very strong impact on me as a teacher, as an artist. Again, I took a little bit of time off, and then I went back for a doctorate eventually at the University of Washington, and they were just gearing up with a computer music program there at that time. So the timing was propitious, and I learned Lisp. Max MSP was just coming out at that time, and I worked with Richard Carpin and John Ron. My main advisor at the University of Washington was Diane Thome, a very fine electroacoustic composer, and she was a very instrumental force for me as well. I guess the rest is sort of history.
Yeah, but it sounds, if I may say so, it seems like there's some missing links there, because going from romantic stylings of the piano to analog synthesis music at Stony Brook, and then somehow transferring from that into Lisp and Max MSP and that kind of stuff. It seems like you had some, I don't know, was it your ear? Was it influences from other people? It sounds like, is it Bulent Orel?
That's his name. Yes.
Yeah. It seems like he was really influential in opening you up to the analog studio. Was there somebody that opened your mind to the digital options or the computer music stuff, or was that something that you kind of tripped on? How did you make that transition, and how comfortable was it, like, leaving behind sort of standard piano repertoire?
That's a really great set of questions. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer how I came to do.
You're the only person that can answer that.
There's an interesting paradox in that when I stopped playing piano, I had only mostly performed tonal music, but then the music that really became of interest to me was experimental music. More recently, I'd say the last 5 years or so, I definitely am interested in studying popular music, structure and harmony and production quality and all that. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I've been filling in certain gaps more recently. But you're right, for a big period of time, when I switched to mostly composing rather than performing, I think maybe one connection that I'd see in both was that I was certainly very interested in minute nuances in sound and shaping sound. And I know that when I was studying traditional repertoire, I would practice phrases, over and over with attention toward the sound, because I didn't know any theory really. So I wasn't thinking about I should voice it this way or I should time the phrasing this way because of some theoretical analysis I had been taught or thought about. I was just listening and working toward perfecting a sound and a shape. And then when I began using computers, it was kind of exciting to be able to control the performance. The first pieces I wrote were really very carefully crafted. So I remember getting excited about that aspect of the sound that I didn't have to, because my first experiences with other people playing pieces I wrote was not so great.
Sure, right.
Because I felt like I have this idea in my head of how it's supposed to sound, and you're not even trying to do these things.
They're not pulling it off.
So why bother? I'll just compose it and perform it myself, and then it'll be perfect. Which is totally 180 degrees from where I am now.
Yeah, I was going to say, what you're doing now is maybe you're carefully crafting tools or carefully crafting the framework that you're going to use during a performance, but everything else is really more an expression of your experience and an expression of your connection with the other person, rather than something that you're tightly controlling. You're not controlling anything.
I think that's true. I think that's true. Mm-hmm.
So do you play piano at all ever anymore?
I'm getting back to it for
really?
Sure. Yeah.
That's
working on Beethoven Violin and Piano Sonata number 8.
One of the things that I like that you said that I found really interesting was this idea of when you were studying theory, that every theory assignment became a composition assignment for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a common experience for people who have been musicians for a considerable amount of time before they were confronted with theory. Mm-hmm. I had a similar path in that I had decades of performance time before I was exposed to theory. And so then when I would get an assignment for theory, rather than saying, well, okay, the assignment is to do X, and so I'm going to perform X on the piece of paper, I immediately was like, well, where have I heard that before? How would it combine with that last thing that I heard? How would it combine with something that, I just experienced this other set of intervals that I want to mix into something? Could this be a bridge for that? It was actually really exciting to go through that.
Mm-hmm. And it's so personal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so, I think when I write something now, sometimes I can't even remember the titles of my pieces. I think that's partly due to a number of things, but I don't feel that attached to everything that comes out of me. But I think when I was, 25 or so, it was quite different. I think every single note that I put on paper, and I was still thinking in notes. I don't think in notes anymore, but it was very exciting to see how each choice had a global impact on possibilities that could come next and what had happened before. And
Sure.
I remember talking to the teacher I was studying with at the time, and quite sure he said something like, well, every moment doesn't have to be a fantastic moment.
I was gonna say the same thing. My experience in going through that was that my theory teacher was like, not everything has to be a diamond. You just have to squirt this thing out, okay? Because I'm coming like with these things and I'm just like anxiously waiting for him to tell me I'm brilliant. That was kind of a rough sled. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this CD that you produced. So first of all, can you say the name of it for me?
Sure, if I can remember it. Harmonique Intérieure.
Okay.
Interior Harmonies.
Oh, all right. Excellent. So I wasn't that far off.
No, you were very close.
In listening to it, I ended up with this really kind of interesting feeling, which is that on one hand, it sounded like the kind of work that could just as easily come out of one of the classic tape studios. It had that really classical kind of computer music sensibility to it and sonic orientation to it. Which is, for me, I mean that as a great compliment because I really love that. There was a certain, I don't know, Babbitt-ness to it or whatever that I really appreciated. But at the same time, there were a lot of sonic signatures that were, very much of the day. And I'm curious, like, from your standpoint in both making the music and in expressing it in recorded form, how influenced are you by, like, that classic electronic and the classic computer music? And what are the areas that you find yourself, sort of pushing the envelope?
Another great question. Well, that CD is now over 3 years old since it came out. So I'm looking back at it, and I think I've moved on quite a bit from them. But at the time, I think I was focused on still trying to bring two worlds together. One is the world of computer music that explores sampling, revels in sampling technique, and the other is the synthetic world. And I had more training with the latter, actually. And I never had a teacher who, I never studied as a guest composer in Birmingham or in the sort of diffusion school, acousmatic school. But I very much admired it. So I was trying to find my own way, my own language of discovering that and using that vocabulary, but also blending it with synthetic techniques.
Sure.
So I think the CD represents some kind of personal hybrid.
Right. So now you say that you feel like you've moved on, which, first of all, okay, too bad, because I really enjoyed the CD.
Maybe I haven't moved on.
But
there may be some inconsistencies in some of the pieces. I feel like a lot of what I did there are things I wasn't yet conscious of exactly what I was doing.
So you're saying you think you might have further refined them, or you just further defined them?
Maybe both, but more the second.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I'm trying increasingly to be reflective of if I'm doing something with sound in a controlled way, I want to have some idea in advance of in the final piece why I'm doing that. If it's moving between speaker 3 and 5, repeatedly and not going to any other speakers, it shouldn't be an arbitrary choice. It should have some, I mean, it could come about serendipitously through the compositional process, but I increasingly am trying to, I guess, figure out why something, how all the parameters that I'm focusing on may have meaning. I've worked for a long time on elevating timbre and texture in my music, and I think still at the time that I created most of the pieces on the CD, my use of those languages was intuitive.
Sure.
So some things work and some things maybe don't work, and I haven't gone back and tried to figure out exactly why or why not.
So then how do you actually stumble upon these things? Do you set up like generative systems and wait and try and capture things? Do you do very pointed experiments and throw away 90% of them? What is the process you go through to capture the things that either timbrally or spatially or kinetically speak to you?
Well, there's a few pieces, including the piece, I believe it's the first track on that CD, is the title Resonance,
Yes.
I believe. Misspelled. So it's making a play on the idea of resonance as a phenomenon, reverberance and resonance as TS, as objects that resonate in space. Mm-hmm. And that piece was based on recorded, high-quality, close-mic'd recordings of percussionists with whom I was working on another piece, on an acoustic piece. And it was actually an acoustic plus fixed media piece. And there was so much fantastic material that was I was just discarding it, that I suddenly was just kind of passionately, I just scooped all this stuff out of the so-called trash heap and decided to make a new piece out of it in which I didn't need the live players, because the liveness of the recordings was so incredible that I wanted to try to work with that. And so that piece, and then a few others in proximity. A lot of what happened is that I was working with live recordings, and through close miking, discovering incredibly interesting features that I then wanted to work with sculpturally and deconstruct in terms of making them larger than life, I might say.
Right.
So it had to do with interaction with live sound. And then another important turn of events, I think, was a couple performers, including Jane Rigler was definitely one of them, who wanted to work together. Another performer was an Irish pipes player named Ivan Goff, with whom I developed a project beginning in 2009, I think, or 10. And the programming became extensive. So I think those two projects were a change, correlated with a change in my working technique, in which a piece was no longer this patch. The piece and the patch became like a field of patches that kept developing, and I kept building on them.
So what you're really saying is that you don't actually have any one particular technique for coming up with these things, but rather you just try and stay attuned to what you're doing and capture the best of that.
Yeah, I do have certain specific programming methodologies that I've been working with. A large set of them include spectral manipulations and a combination of algorithmic interventions at a micro surface level. So I like sounds that have a lot of surface detail.
So where do you find yourself if I were to pop into your studio tomorrow and catch you working on, some directions for your next experimentations? What would those look like? What are the areas that you find yourself drawn towards now?
Well, let's see, I would give that away. I guess I can give it away.
Well, you could give it a name that nobody would recognize, and then it would satisfy me, but not give away. We could TM it, and then nobody else could use it.
As of this week, I've been working with mapping pitch and spatial location together. So combining those two parameters so that when a particular frequency deformation happens, it always happens in the same spot. And I'm trying to see what effect that has on really complicated movements in terms of reinforcing the way we hear. So we might not just hear a microtonal melody, but we'd hear a microtonal melody in which the melodic shape happens in a 3D space.
So it literally becomes a shape, not only in terms of movement, tonal movement, but in physical movement terms as well.
Right.
Interesting. Very cool. So we could call that like the, I don't know. I was going to try and make up a name, and now I've like shot that for myself. I'm going to hoard all the good names for myself. I'm sorry. So, one last question, and I've used up more than my share of your time here anyway. It goes back to the idea of your ideas being, at least a lot of what you're interested in now having to do with spatial stuff. To what extent do you find that focus to be limiting for your opportunities to perform? Do you find that there are enough places that have multi-speaker arrays that you can do it, or do you feel like that's something that you struggle finding venues to do your thing?
Well, 8 is not all that rare now. So I'd say, I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't know that my techniques are that advanced at this point that I have felt any, been focused on the deficits of working in one space and then taking it to a space that doesn't really correlate. Okay. But that's a challenge in itself. I think I'm more focused on accepting the fact that it's part of the beast of making electronic music, in that you can't carry your instrument with you.
Right.
And so I'm focused on developing more sophisticated ears and techniques and robust techniques in pieces so that pieces can stand up in different environments.
Right.
I think, to me, that's an interesting phenomenon. What allows a piece that you might compose on... there's actually a piece on the CD that you've mentioned. That's the oldest piece on there. It's called Alamuchi. And that was, I think, the first piece of mine that I composed where I realized I can play it on one set of speakers in a performance space. And that was a stereo piece that I don't think I created an 8-channel mix of it. I think it remains just a stereo piece. But every time I performed it, it was really rich and very effective. I made a mental note that that's definitely a quality that I'm interested in, rather than composing something that can only be played in a very specific environment.
Right.
I was excited by the fact that different spaces and different speaker systems would act as filters for the same piece and bring out different features of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think with the spatialization question, I'm sort of interested in attempting that also. How do you create movement between, let's say you're just throwing something around in a circular fashion at a certain speed. You can create a program where you can adjust the speed depending on the space on the fly, or you can create patterns that create panning that don't collapse if the radii change. These are all things, there's no one right answer, but I think it's, I'm more interested in spaces that have good speakers and good acoustics rather than a duplicated scenario.
Right, a duplicated environment, right. That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to think of, or to try and imagine, what are the qualities of a piece that make it withstand changes in venue. It's yet another psychoacoustic mystery that would be interesting to dive into. Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you so much for your time. It was really great talking to you, and great kind of exploring some ideas and letting me drift off into imaginary land here a little bit. But also, it makes me really badly want to experience your music in this kind of environment and see you work with live performers. Do you have any performances coming up anytime soon?
I do, and I want to take this moment to thank you for your incredibly provocative questions that are probably going to have some impact on me. So I really appreciate that. Let's see. On June 6th, I have a performance with violinist Maya Sarar at the New York City Electronic Music Festival, and that'll be a premiere. It's a piece for violin and live electronics. And then I have an acoustic solo violin piece being premiered on June 11th by Pauline Kim Harris as part of a project called Chaconne, where she commissioned a number of composers to write pieces in response to the Bach Chaconne, D minor.
Right. Well, that's fantastic. Hopefully the listeners will get a chance to, if they're in the neighborhood, or get a chance to see that. And unfortunately, I'm going to be in the middle of a move. Otherwise, I'm always looking for a reason to come into New York. So that would have almost rang a bell for me. But so thank you again so much for the time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you. And do holler if you're in the neighborhood.
All right, I'll do it. Bye now.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Many thanks to Elizabeth for the chat. Many thanks to Jane for the introduction. And many thanks to all my friends out there that are helping this podcast get out. That includes my friends over at Synthopia, all of my friends and coworkers at Cycling 74, and you, the listener, who are doing a great job of sharing this with your friends, making sure that people pay attention to what we're doing here. Thank you so much, all, and I will catch you next week. Bye.